everybody today. Glad that we can be here, be assembled together. Even if on a 30-degree day, it's still fairly warm out there as long as you keep moving. You stop and you might get frozen in place. But it's good to be here. It's good if you're visiting with us online this morning. We're so glad that you can be here. And before class, we will sing number 405, "Oh, the Fount of Every Blessing." We'll sing the first and third verses of this song. Number 405. Oh, the fount of every blessing, to my heart to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy, never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me ever to adore thee, may I will thy goodness prove, while the hope of endless glory fills my heart with joy and praise. Let me drop that down just a little bit. Oh, the grace, how great a debtor daily I constrain to be. Let thy goodness, like a fetter, bind my wandering heart to thee. Teach me every wonder from thee, never leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. My vocals must have got frozen outside. Sorry about that. If you will, we'll go to our classes at this time.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good to have everybody with us this morning. We're going to be in Psalm 78. Psalm 78, as we continue our study through the book of Psalms and looking here at what we can find in them and realizing the importance of what we see. We are going through each one of these. We said the 5 books that are found in the book of Psalms, meaning the 5 divisions, and we are still in book 3. Book 3, we will finish up, I'm sure, chapter 78 today and move into 84. I'm going to jump to 84 and then jump back to 81 probably through the class after that. But 78 is where we're at. We actually started this 78 last week, and as we were looking at it, the question that we ask here is when people ask, can God? And when they think about this, what it means by is people are really wondering, can God do this or that? You know, can he really accomplish this or that? And we need to understand that God can do all things. He can do everything, and it's important for us to see the importance of that and how great that is. As we look at here, we know that the writer here, Asaph, is talking about Israel, the people of God, how they basically had questioned God when he was bringing them out of Egypt through the wilderness, and just time and time again, and there were a lot of things going on in their lives that should have been easy to understand, that God is taking care of this regardless of what you may think. He's going to do it. He's going to have it. But we know we talked about the heart condition of the people, and that's where it came down to, is that their hearts were not conditioned in the way they needed to be. They were a faithless people, is what we were told in verses 19 through 20. And you think about how interesting that is, knowing of everything that they went through and everything that they saw with God and his faith and the amazing miracles that he possessed and did. And they were still just faithless in that, which then, of course, made them forgetful. They were forgetful. We talked about that with remembering the things that he had done for them, taking care of their enemies and getting them through every day. And because of that, because of being faithless and forgetful, it turned them into foolish people. And you know, the Bible's very careful about calling people fools. The Bible says not to do so. But God tells us here that they were foolish. were doing, because they specifically asked the question more than once, can God really do this? So we ended up talking about those 10 faithless spies, as they saw the giants, and knowing that there were only 2 that said, God can do it, and if they would have made that decision, that choice, they know that it's exactly what would have happened. So going through all that, we looked at the heart of the people, and then we moved in, of course, to the heart of God. Because this is where we really have to pay attention to, God's heart. And we know we talked about his promises and the importance that were found in them. And we just see as we look at each one of these, the heart of God, we saw his promises last week in 78, 5 through 7. And then we discussed all these other areas here of the Bible, which left us with this next point where we're going to be at this morning, and that is his performance. So as we think about this, before we go any further, go ahead and look at 78. Let's go and look at 78. And I'm going to go ahead and read 1 through 7. And I want us to see what it says here. It says, "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth." So it makes it very clear to do that. It says, listen to what I'm saying, and incline yourself. In other words, hold on to every word that is out there that I'm speaking, that I am a part of. And he says in verse 2, "I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Lord, and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done. For he established a testimony in Jacob, appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, and they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, and they may arise and declare them to their children, and they may set their hope in God, and don't forget the works of God, but keep his commandments." Brethren, we know everything that Asaph said there was just the opposite of what Israel did. They didn't do that because we said they were forgetful of everything. They didn't teach each generation of what was needing to be done and what God had done for that. So we saw God's promises. He kept his promises. Israel had seen God keep his word time and time again, and knowing that he was always faithful to do what he promised for them to do. Which brings us to this next point, as we said, his performance. So everyone look back at 78, verse 4, one more time. In verse 4, it says, "We will not hide them from their children, telling the generation to come the praises of the Lord, and his strength and his wonderful works that he has done." And then in verse 12, "Marvelous things he did in the sight of their fathers, in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan." So throughout their history, remember, Israel had enjoyed the presence of the power of the Almighty God. They'd enjoyed the presence of that and that power that was found in him. Time and again, God had demonstrated his power in the midst of his people. Remember, imagine seeing, we said this before, what it would be like to see someone part an entire sea. And to think that God, and I know this is what I always look at. We always look, what an amazing, amazing miracle. I don't think just the parting of the Red Sea is probably one of the most amazing parts of it. But here he parted it, and they didn't wait weeks, months to cross. How quickly did they start crossing? Immediately. Have you ever walked in something that has been, say, water been over it, say, for months or years or whatever, and tried to walk through it in boots? And what usually happens at the bottom of that water? It's sludgy, it's muddy, and you might even get sludgy. You may come out there tonight and have a boot on. I mean, it gets stuck, and you see this. Imagine these people. They walked right across, and it said it was dry land. What a miracle for God to move the waters and dry that fast. It's just amazing. And to think that they saw this, that they saw the manna drop from heaven every day, brother, for 40 years. Imagine seeing God defeat not just one or two of your enemies, but all your enemies. Imagine the thrill of seeing his glory as he came down upon the tabernacle. And we're going to look at that in a little bit when we get to chapter 81. I mean, just this great flame, and that glory of God shining as we see. And of course, we also know that cloud and fire, the pillar above. God had proven himself time and time and time again through his people. It's just amazing. And then we look at the Lord today. Has God changed? Has God changed since the time of the Israelites? No. We say no. He is still coming through for his people today. I want you to think about this. I want you to look back over the years and remember the times the Lord has displayed His great power in your life. Think about those times. Hasn't He parted the waters for you sometime or another? Not literally the Red Sea or something, but part of the waters. Hasn't He opened the heavens and dropped down manna of His glory on your life and over and over? Hasn't He moved in the response of cries of faith? He has proven Himself to all of us repeatedly. And you know what happens sometimes in our Christian walk, and this is what we saw with the Israelites, we focus on the things that we don't think God took care of for us. Focus on the bad. But think about how much good God has done in our lives. And this is what Asaph was trying to tell Israel here. You need to focus on the heart of God. His performance is remarkable. But they couldn't get to it. They couldn't see it. But then they would come back. And then they would go back away from Him again and again. Those things happen. But it doesn't stop there. So we saw His promise. We see His performance and we see His power. And we already read verse 4 where it said at the end there that His strength and His wonderful works that He has done. See, brethren, throughout history, God had proven that He was stronger than every obstacle they ever faced. And not just most obstacles, every obstacle. He was more powerful than Egypt and the Amalekites. Remember what I said? Egypt was the most powerful, we would say nation during the time of Egypt. We see when they were ruling over the Israelites and all other people of other countries. Then you had the Amalekites, and like I said, He proved Himself to be greater than their thirst and their hunger. He was able to overcome all they faced, and it was all because of His great power. That's what the Bible tells us, His great power. We have that power today too, and we have it in the gospel is what it tells us, in the Word, and we have that great power of God. Brethren, God is still all-powerful. He is omniscient. Think about it. Power of God has not nor shall ever falter. He is all-powerful, and He shall remain so until the end of an unending eternity. Think about that. To the end, to get that to the end of an unending eternity. It's never going to end, His power that is found in Him. So what I want to do this morning is I want us to real quick think about it this way. I want to remind us just of all that, that God possesses the power, not only in heaven, but also on earth. And when it says that God possesses power in heaven and on earth, where does that mean? Where does He refer to heaven? We think it's just where God and Christ are. Where does He have power at? Where does He have, we see this power possessed at? Everywhere. So we say, well, everywhere we can see. No, it's everywhere. No matter what we see and what we don't see. There you go. Anything that is out and is there, it's just what we find. Anything that God has created, He has power over it. And guess what? God has created all things. And how wonderful it is to understand that. In fact, Matthew 28, so we'll go and read that for us. Matthew chapter 28, verse 18, please. Matthew 28, verse 18.
And Jesus said it, and Jesus came and spake unto them, saying, My power is given unto me in heaven and earth.
Thank you. My power is given to me. All authority is another way of looking at that. Power, that authority was given to Him. Who gave it to Jesus? God, His Father, gave it to Him. Our Father that we look at and understand. And you think about, and that shows us there that if God gave this power to Jesus, God has always had that power. And we understand everything with it. And here He gives it to Him, understanding that He is going to be ruling over all things. But it doesn't end there. Everyone also turn over to Luke chapter 1, verse 37. I want you to see this. Luke chapter 1, verse 37. Now, this is the beginning of the life. In Luke chapter 1, verse 37, and we see that it tells us about the strength that is found in our Lord and Savior and the greatness that is found there and with God. And this is a very small verse, but a very simple verse. But there is so much in this verse. So we'll go and read that for us.
For with God, nothing will be impossible.
Okay, think about that verse there. For with God, nothing will be impossible. Now let me ask you this. If the Israelites would have gone back and thought about this verse, and you can't say that, well, I talked about it in only in the New Testament. Genesis 18 talks about it, and Jeremiah talked about it also. And so we see this. That means there is no reason for anybody to ever be concerned, to ever worry, let me rephrase it, to ever worry about things in this life, knowing that God, all things are possible with Him. There's nothing impossible. Now, once again, we may not, what we expect God to do may not happen. Do you think God, and I've always said this, you know, when something I'm like, I prayed for it, and it just didn't happen, I'm like, okay, all right, that's the way it is. Do you think God knows what's better for us than we know ourselves? God knows what we can handle. God knows what we can't handle. I'll just say, I had a discussion with somebody one time that over finances, over money, and they were just beside themselves. They couldn't understand why God wasn't blessing them with more money, and they saw others, you know, doing this, and they just come complaining about it. And I said, you know, I see the problem. And they said, what do you mean you see the problem? I said, I see exactly what God sees, I'm sure, because just the way you're talking to me, we're explaining it. You couldn't handle it. And they, of course, they got angry for a second there. They're like, what do you mean I couldn't handle the money? God gave me money, I'll be fine with it. And I said, you can't, you're showing that right now. I said, God knows the trouble you would get into if he did that for you. See, God knows, and I asked him, I said, does God give you enough to make it in this life where you're comfortable, you're doing okay? Well, yeah, but I want more. There it is. God knows what we need and what we don't need. That's just one example of millions that we can think of. So think about Job 42. Everyone look at Job 42. In Job chapter 42, we see these words, and you remember Job, we all know what Job went through and how bad it was for him and difficult, and here he's at the end of everything is getting better again because he kept his faith, it was strong, he defeated Satan, and he didn't defeat Satan, remember, on his own, it was with God that he defeated Satan. And Job 42 verse 2 says this, I'm going to read that for us.
I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you.
Look at that. So here's what's important to understand this verse. So as we see there in 42, this is where we see what we're getting at. You know, I know that you can do everything. So if that was all the verse said, and people thought about it, they'd be like, I know you can do everything, so you need to take care of it for me, whatever I ask. It's not what he says. Look what Job came to understand. Do you think Job wanted to lose his family? Do you think Job wanted to lose all his possessions? Do you think he wanted to lose all his livestock? Do you think he wanted to go through the boils and all the difficulties that he went through? Of course not. But look what he says. I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours will be withheld from you. The purpose of God. That's what it's all about, brethren, when we think about the power that is found in it and what we see when it has to come back to the purpose of God. Which brings us to this next point. So we see all the power he has in heaven and on earth and God's own testimony about it. I want you to look at this. It's not what we've read others said about his power, but notice God's own testimony, what he says about it. Everyone look at Genesis 18. Genesis chapter 18, we go all the way back to this time at the beginning. And Genesis chapter 18, we know things have been going for a while. And here we have Abraham and Sarah. And Genesis 18, and I'll just say this, Abraham and Sarah, were they old at this point? They weren't just older, they were old, weren't they? I mean, they were way beyond, childhood. I mean, and anything you'd expect. In fact, most people at this time aren't just preparing to retire, they're preparing to die. I mean, and we see that's not the case. And look what he says here, Genesis 18. So I'm going to read that for us. Genesis chapter 18, verse 14.
Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed, I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son.
Just remarkable. And what's been interesting here, here's where we see the power of God. Because some will say, the only way God works is if your faith, it's your faith that makes it work. That's what these televangelists do today and everything. They just say, send me this and you'll get this. And then someone sits back and says, I never got what you told me I was going to get. Oh, it was because your faith wasn't strong enough. That's what we see. Look what happens to the verse right before that. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child since I am old? What did Sarah think about that when God said you're going to have a child? What did she think? Like, yeah, I'm ready for that. What did she think? That ain't going to happen. There ain't no way. I know how things work biologically. This is just impossible. And we see this. Her faith wasn't as strong. Even Abraham, for a minute, there was like, what? But he was still going to follow God. And because of Abraham's faith, we see. And then Sarah, of course, finally comes to the conclusion of it. But God told me before that, said, she's going to have a son. So it was God. It was power. found in him, there's nothing unavailable for God to do. Anybody have a comment? Thought I may have saw a hand. Nope. If I don't see your hand, don't look it down, just shout at me. All right, Jeremiah 32. Everyone turn over there. So let's not stop there. We understand that God is able. Jeremiah 32:27, and Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20. God is able. Now that's a huge thing. Has anybody ever, maybe I don't know what you may do in your life, a hobby or, a job, whatever, and maybe somebody said, hey, I know Ernie over there, he's able to do that. And, have you ever had anybody say that about you, probably? I'm sure we all have. Someone's referred them to you or whatever it is. Oh, they're able to do that, or they're able to find this for you or do that. Brother, we need to understand, God isn't only able to do a few things. He is able to do how many things? Everything. And that's what we see with this. So we'll go and read Jeremiah 32 for us. Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 27, please. Verse 27.
Behold, I am the Lord thy God, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me?
So here, the word of the Lord comes to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's questioning a few things, and he says, you need to let the people know, plus this is for you. Do you really think there's anything too hard for me? I mean, think about that. You really think, can we say that? Is there anything hard here for people to do? Is there anything hard for us to do? I guarantee you last week I couldn't even bend down and put my socks on after I fell. I mean, it just wasn't going to happen. But now I can reach up to my plant, doing good. I can do that. It was hard. But we see this. Is there anything hard for us to do? Of course there is. There's always things out there that are difficult to do. With God, and this is what I love, it reminds Jeremiah, he says, and I like how God says, there's nothing too hard for me. God reminds him, says, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you really think there's anything too hard for me to do? Or anything too hard for me at all? He wants Jeremiah to know that answer. Just like you and I today. The Israelites had forgotten about this. But what we see. Yeah, go ahead.
It's being the little children that we're supposed to be. We think about our children when they're growing up. Mom and dad can do anything.
Yep.
And that's the way we need to look at God. Because we have limitations, but God doesn't.
Right.
It's the same way we need to look at it.
That's exactly right. And that's I have a coffee cup that says Papa, I think, or Dad, maybe say Dad. Dad can fix anything, or somebody can fix it. He fix it. And that's what we look at. I'll admit I can fix just about anything, but there may be some things out there I can't. But it comes out of God. God doesn't question. He doesn't go, okay, let me start thinking what I can. And that's exactly right. And this is the thing about it. Do you not want that God on your side? If we have somebody, if you have a friend that could do just almost anything, and that's who you go to ask for help or advice or whatever, it's great to have them. Imagine we have a God that's beyond that. And this is what he wants them to understand, and for us to understand too today. There, go ahead.
That's the other thing. The Israelites, when they were in Egypt for so many years, saw the limitations of the gods.
Right?
And their mindset may have been, well, God's going to be limited some way. And he's telling them, I'm not.
Yeah.
Through everything he's done.
And that's a great point, because you're right. Time and time again, they saw the gods fell to the people, the Egyptians. And imagine when Moses was taking them out there, their gods, should have supposedly. I love how God just, attacked or went after, one god that was over, like the god of the river, the god of Nile, the god of the animal frogs. God was going to, and now, it shows God was able to take care of everything. And that's what we have. It's exactly right. And the Israelites could have been, all those years they were there, and that's what they were used to seeing. But what was happening here? There was the beginning. God through Moses was trying to show the people, look, I am not one that falters. I can defeat everything these other gods supposedly can do, and I can do things you've never even heard about. Who had ever heard about somebody, opening a sea hub like that? They never heard of that. The Nile had never done that. The Nile may have, had a little bit of a drought zone, but it continued to flow. But you think about that, of what we see. Which brings us to Ephesians chapter 3. Everyone look at Ephesians chapter 3. I want us to really see this verse where we see Paul talking to those at Ephesus, and he was just reassuring them that God is able, and it reassures us too today as we look to this. So, Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20. So we'll go ahead and read that for us, please.
Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us.
Imagine this now. Here's Paul talking as an apostle, about the miracles they were able to do, but also talking about the providence of God that we still have today, that we understand this. I love the word there. He doesn't say, now to him who is able to do everything. He says exceedingly abundantly. I mean, think about those words twice that are there. And this is what I love here about it. It's not just what we ask. What's that next word there that you read, Carson? Ask or think. Anything that comes to our mind that we think, except for those things that are evil. Everything. Think about what he's able to do. Exceedingly abundantly. When we ask, or when we start thinking, I don't know if God's going to get me through this time. What are we reacting like? Just like the Israelites that Asaph was talking about there in Psalm 78. And we have to be careful with that. We never want to question, can God? We always want to be on the side saying, God can. And that's what we look to. Which brings us to this next point. Everyone look over at his patience. See, here's what it takes for God to be able to get through these things of the Israelites, and even get through things that go on in our life that we may react and act sometimes, is God has to have patience. I mean, how many here have prayed for patience before? How many here have prayed for patience? And then after you did it, you thought that was a mistake. I mean, because then next thing you know, something happens. And it's teaching you patience. And we see that. And there's nothing wrong asking for patience. You just got to be careful when you do it. And what we see here, that patience is important. Patience is one of those virtues that is really going to get us through this life. Because in a fast-paced world we live in, impatience is very easy to happen. I mean, it comes constantly around us. But here's God. God and his patience. Everyone look back at Psalm 78. Someone go and read there, verse 38 for us. Psalm 78, verse 38.
But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquities and destroyed them not. Yet many a time turned he his anger away and did not stir up all his wrath.
Look at that. It says, number one, that he didn't destroy them, and he turned his anger away, didn't stir up all his wrath, and that's important to understand. Sometimes God, his wrath would come out, but it wasn't all his wrath, and that's important to realize. But it all comes down to this, back in verse 30, but he being full of compassion. God is a compassionate God. While God continued to show himself strong, here it is, on behalf of his people, and showing that he could do anything, they didn't even think about this, Israel continually lacked the faith to trust the Lord as they should have. However, the Bible tells us, brothers, we just see right here, that many times he turned his anger away from them. He was patient with them and led them along in love and grace. See, that's what we need to observe today. We need to realize that God is a compassionate God. God is a loving God. And God is willing to do what we just saw here at the first part of that verse. What is he willing to do for these people, just like he's willing to do for us? Compassion, and did what? Forgave their iniquity, their sins. He's willing to do so. See, this is where it all comes down today. You look at this part up here. Thank God that we serve a patient God. How many times do we think he has demonstrated that for us? I want you to really think about it. How many times do you think God has demonstrated his patience in your life, in my life? How many times have we felt maybe to walk away? We shouldn't, and we felt and maybe we did walk away our faith in the Lord. But instead of throwing us away, he continues to love us and work in our lives. We have a patient, loving Lord. Whenever I've counseled with someone before, and they said, I just think I've gone too far. I don't think God will forgive me. And I'm like, don't think that way. We serve a patient God, and what I mean by patience is he's patient, waiting for us to come back. Long-suffering God. He wants us back. I always use the description, I've said this before, whenever someone says they've sinned too much, God won't forgive them, I always bring up Paul, of course, about killing Christians. To us, that would sound like one of the worst sins probably ever you could do. It's not just kill somebody, but kill a Christian because they're a Christian. And God forgave them for that. And brethren, we see God forgive these Israelites for as low as their faith went, almost completely away. Well, it says they forgot about it. What can he always do for us? Brethren, times over. And that's who we have. So what is the challenge for you and I today? You know, I want you to think about this. What is the challenge for you and I today? How many here like being challenged? And no, we're like, well, it depends on what you're talking about. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, challenges are fun. Some challenges are like, no, you can take that challenge. I don't want that challenge. You know, and we see, you know, that's how everybody was with Goliath. That's how we see the 12 spies, the 10 spies. We don't want the challenge. And, you know, we see it. But what about the challenge for you and I today? Look back at verse 6. Everyone look back at verse 6 and 8. Someone go ahead and read verses 6 and 8. This is the challenge. This is the challenge for them back then, and this is the challenge for us today. Psalm 78, beginning in verse 6. 6 through 8. Someone like to read it. Psalm 78, 6 through 8.
That the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and may not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright, and whose spirit was not faithful to God.
Now, of course, we know God is talking about the Israelites here, Asaph, because that's what their generations were doing before them. Their fathers, we see time has gone on a while here, past the time, of course, of Egypt and Israel in the wilderness, and all this happening. But brethren, when we look at Israel's history and the way God proved himself to them, then what we need to do is we need to consider how he has proven himself once again to us in our own lives. And when we look at his power and his ability, what are we to do with that information? When we look at his power and his ability, what are we to do with that information? Well, I'm going to show you here what the Bible says. These verses tell us, on no uncertain terms, what the Lord expects from us in relationship to those truths. What he expects every day from you and I. See, this is what it is, number one. We need to always have confidence in God. In other words, a simple word for that whole sentence right there is trust. We need to always trust our Father in heaven. And look what it tells us here. Everyone begin in Mark chapter 11. See in Mark chapter 11. You know, let me ask you this. Once you know, if someone you trusted and they do something, I mean bad, they do something bad against you, and they lose your trust, how hard is it sometimes for you to trust, you know, that trust to get back? Does it happen quickly? No. It takes time. And we see this. But here's the thing about God. Is God ever going to do anything untrustful to us? No. So there's no reason to ever say, well, I'll think about trusting you again later. There's no reason for us to walk away from the trust of God, because his trust is always trusting. It's always, you know, always that confidence that is found in it. This is what we find in Mark 11, verse 22, where we have Jesus here speaking, and he says these words. So someone go ahead, and it's a very simple verse. He just says, I think it's 4 words that he says right here in verse 22. Someone go ahead and read it.
And Jesus answered and said unto them, have faith in God.
There it is. Have faith in God. Trust comes with that faith, we understand. Have faith in God, trust in him and everything that comes with him, because he can get you through it. He can take care of those things. This is the confidence. This is what Asaph wanted Israel to understand, because they had forgotten it. He said you need to have faith in God, because if you have faith in God, you're going to trust him. And you're going to do everything in your power to make sure you're doing those things that are right by him. Which brings us to Psalm 62. Everyone turn to Psalm 62. Let's go and read Psalm 62, verse 8. Once again, this is a great psalm here. Psalm 62, verse 8. Someone go ahead and read that for us.
Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us.
Thank you. So, trust in him 95% of the time, right? What does all times mean to us? 100%, right? I mean, you know, everything he gives there. And this is what I love. He says, you know, if we trust him, God is where our refuge is. Where do we turn for protection? Where do we turn for our refuge? It's in him. And then John 14:1, before I run out of time, almost out of time here. John chapter 14, everyone turn over there real quick. John 14, verse 1. And once again, this is just Jesus here. Not just Jesus. Jesus speaking here. Someone go and read verse 1 for us, chapter 14 of John. John 14:1.
Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me.
Yeah, I mean, there it is. If you trust in God, you're going to trust in Jesus. And you're not going to be troubled. And I love how that verse says, let not your what be troubled? Your heart. Now that doesn't mean just your feelings. You know, the heart a lot of times the Bible refers to the mind. And it's that thinking process there. And so here we have, so what do these verses do before we close? These verses teach us that we are to trust Him for all our needs and in every single situation, 100% of the time. When the world waves its hand in despair and doubt and asks the question, can God? Can God really do that? We who believe the Bible should stand up and cry out, God can. Without a doubt. God can. When the world looks at a declining morality, escalating violence, economic troubles, decrease in popularity of the church, increasing evil, and asks the question, can God? Once again, we must be ready to answer, God can. This has always been the way it was throughout the Bible, and still is today. Next week, we'll look at real quick for just a moment. We're going to look at 4 individuals, and then we're going to look at the apostles for a moment, and then we're going to, of course, look at in 1 Kings 17, the widow of Zarephath. You know, we know with the flour, and you know those great ones that always said God can. Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remarkable story there. And Daniel in the lion's den. You know, we see here and understand that, you know, Darius spends the whole night saying, can God? And Daniel's down there going, you know, maybe petting a cat, I don't know, but going, God can. And that's what we see. So let's go and close with that. Any comments or questions? Because we're out of time. Anybody else? Nope. All right, we'll go ahead and end there, and we'll start back at that spot next week. It'll take us about 10 minutes, and we'll move into chapter 84. All right, thank you.